no matter where it leads. This is Steve Deace.
Well, we're pleased to be joined now by a man that is much more well-known around the country than he even was 10 days ago. And that is U.S. Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, who put on, along with some of his cohorts, like Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, quite a show in the U.S. Senate. I described it on this show as sort of a 13-hour seminar on the U.S. Constitution, and it was a filibuster that really captured the imagination of a lot of political observers around the country. And frankly, it's one of the few times in the last many years that I actually think if our founding fathers were alive today, they might actually be proud of how we've utilized the system that they gave us. So we are pleased to have Rand join us now. And I'm sure this is about the 897th interview you have done since last week, Senator. Thank you very much for carving out some time for us.
Well, we've been pretty busy, and it was one of those things that was hard to anticipate, but it was something I felt strongly about, that really, when I talk to our young soldiers in Kentucky who are overseas fighting for us, they tell me they're fighting for our freedoms, they tell me they're fighting for our Bill of Rights, and I just think of how disappointed they would be to come home and find that we're no longer obeying the Bill of Rights, that we think somehow that because we're at war, that the Bill of Rights no longer applies. And I think our soldiers would be disappointed that they've risked life and limb and often had horrendous injuries to come home to people who said, well, it's not that big a deal whether you get a trial by a jury with an accusation or whether or not your government can target individuals with a drone. So I did consider it to be a battle that really rose to such an importance that it was more important even than the person's nomination that I was trying to stop, but really rose to an important constitutional question.
Take us, let's get into the background of how this came about. How much of this was planned? How much of this happened spontaneously? Can you kind of give us the background on this filibuster?
My office staff and I had talked about, trying to get several hours of debate on drones and even the possibility of a filibuster. But the morning when I came in, if I, had really planned it well, I would have worn a lot better shoes. And so I get there with some of my most uncomfortable shoes. And as I walk in, I say, well, you know what, if the floor is open, maybe I'll start, a real filibuster. And so that really it's something not really set in stone other than the fact that I said, send over the information and we'll see what happens. The other thing you don't know is the majority party can guard the floor. And they don't do this literally, but they guard it by putting legislation on the floor that occupies time and space, and the rules prevent anybody from talking in a filibuster. But that morning
they essentially filibuster the filibuster, in other words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that morning they left it open, and so I rose to speak in the beginning and tried to preempt Harry Reid, and he gets preference. But there was a senator in the chair, and she was fairly new, and I thought, well, maybe she'll recognize me. She didn't, because that's the first rule they teach you, is never recognize the minority before you recognize the majority leader. So anyway, I thought maybe they would consider that something was up, and but still about 25 minutes later, after a couple of other senators spoke, I stood to speak, and I told them I was just going to, we'd wait on having any kind of agreement until after I had my chance to speak, but I don't think they'd realize that I might go on for 13 hours.
Did you realize at that time that you would go on for 13 hours?
No. In fact, I wasn't sure how long I would go. I figured I wanted to really make my point, and I got going, and then I just decided, sort of like Forrest Gump running across the country back and forth, I thought, well, I just wasn't ready to stop, and I also thought, that any kind of filibuster, your point is louder and more noticed the longer you go. And so we went on, and then as I was tiring out in the middle of the afternoon, some senators started to arrive. Senator Mike Lee from Utah came, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas came, and so gradually more and more people began to support it. And so we just kept going, and I got a little bit of a second burst of energy later on in the day. And then our goal was to make it into the new day, to make it past midnight, because then if they had to vote, it would be on Saturday. And like most good congressmen, they hate to work on the weekend. And we thought, well, you know what? We'll use that as leverage to try to get the White House to respond. But in the end, I think we shamed the White House into responding. They finally did respond and said, you know what? We don't really have the authority to do it. We didn't want to answer your question. We evaded it for 6 weeks. But in the end, they finally admitted they don't have the right to kill you if you're not engaged in lethal combat.
U.S. Senator Rand Paul is our guest here tonight. Rand, how much of this material did you have available ahead of time? What I think was so powerful about what you and the men that you mentioned to finally kind of side saddled up next to you during this effort, what was really so powerful about what you guys did is it was substantive. There weren't gimmicks. You weren't doing nursery rhymes or phone book readings when you ran out of material, but it was substantive. It was convicting without being angry. And I think that's what made it very, very powerful. How much of that argumentation was spontaneous? Because, listen, I'm someone that when I speak, I don't bring a script. I don't have a speech. I don't have notes. I don't do this show with notes. But 13 hours, man, even for a guy like me with a really big mouth, 13 hours of ad-libbed material would be stretching the limits.
We had 2 big binders full of articles and essays, basically on drone warfare and on the president's assertions. I had written an introduction that was about 2 minutes long. So I went from my introduction pretty much, and then I probably spoke for about 4 or 5 hours just extemporaneously on the subject. And I might have repeated myself once or twice, but I kind of took to looking at the gallery, and the gallery turns over about every 30 or 40 minutes, and I figured, well, you know what, that's a new crowd. I'll talk to them, and I may repeat something I told the previous crowd. And so in my mind, I did that, and then I also thought to myself, well, you know what? Steve Deace does this for 4 hours. Certainly I can go longer than that. And so I figured that, so I went on, and then after a while, then there was a period of time for about an hour or so, I was kind of flagging later in the afternoon, and I began to read some of the articles. They were still on the subject, but I began to read some and then sort of stop in the middle and comment on the article as I was reading it and the point. And that went on for a while, but then when some of the other senators came, gave me a little bit of break, I stretched my legs, and I wasn't allowed to sit or leave to go to the bathroom, and so those are the main limitations on filibustering. And in the old days, the senators, I think, would cheat. They'd sort of go halfway into the cloakroom and do whatever they needed to do, but that was before there was TV, and I thought the image of me going halfway into the cloakroom and that being on national TV was probably not a good image to leave the folks with. So.
No, considering what they did to Senator Rubio for just taking a drink.
Yes, for having to take a drink of water.
Now, I do have to mention that he gave me some crummy advice, though. He came to the floor to be supportive, and he says, I have some advice to you. Just remember to drink water. And I'm like, Marco, that's the whole point. I don't need to be drinking water.
Yeah, you have to go to the bathroom if you do that. That's right.
There are repercussions to that, and so but we laughed, and it was nice that he came and was supportive, and a bunch of the senators did, and that made it better. It wasn't me all by myself in the end. There were probably 15 or 20 senators, and really it was remarkable. A bunch of congressmen came too, and they just heard about it on television and came over. And you rarely see congressmen come on into the Senate chamber. They're allowed to come in. They're not allowed to speak. And same way we can go into their chambers but not speak. But we had about 15 or 20 conservative congressmen that came over as well.
I want to give you a chance, Senator, to respond to some criticisms or detractors. Number one,
certainly there wasn't any criticism.
I'm sure. Well, just
read that.
Just a teensy bit, I'm sure. Number one, this was just grandstanding. You're doing this. I think John McCain's words were for impressionable young libertarians. How would you respond to that?
I would say that basically what motivated me to do this is that I strongly believe that our Bill of Rights applies to Americans, and that even though we are at war with people who don't like us and are dangerous people, the reason we're fighting this war is to preserve our freedoms. And so if we give up our freedoms here at home, I think that's a disservice to those who have been overseas for the last 10 years fighting for us. And so I just don't accept that. There have been some who have said this is frivolous, and I don't think the Bill of Rights is frivolous. And I think that to be accused of a crime or to be called something like an enemy combatant, who gets to judge that? Does President Obama get to decide if you're an enemy combatant, or should a jury of your peers decide that? And you can imagine how, let's say you're an Arab American and you live here and you're a good, solid American, but you email cousins of yours who live in the Middle East. Let's say somebody is watching those cousins and think they might be a terrorist. does that automatically mean that we could target you for a drone strike because you're now associated with terrorism? Or should you get to explain yourself? Should you get accused that you might be associated with terrorism and get your day in court? And I think most Americans, Republican or Democrat, and I think that's what brought a lot of people together on both sides of the political spectrum, most people would say, well, for goodness sakes, that would be an accusation. You would get to defend yourself with an attorney and a jury trial. But the people on the McCain and Graham side, they say, oh, America's a battlefield, so the laws of war apply. But in the law of war, you don't get due process. And I agree with them on that. If you're in a battlefield in Afghanistan, someone's shooting at you, they don't get a lawyer or a trial. But if you're here in America and someone's going to say you're associated with bad people, you would obviously get a trial.
What about the criticism, hey, I appreciate what Senator Paul did here, but this is the same guy that voted for Chuck Hagel, that, as you well know, a lot of conservatives around the country don't like, both for being all mavericky with John McCain when he was a senator, and there's a perception that he is not a friend to Israel. So what do you say about people who say there's a contradiction there? Why take the stand here and then turn around and vote for Chuck Hagel? I'm sure you've heard that. How would you respond?
Well, I would say is that I was the 41st vote to filibuster Chuck Hagel. I was the one that tried to prevent the nomination from occurring without getting more information. 2 or 3 days later, the people who are my fiercest critics, Senator McCain and Graham, came forward and announced they would no longer filibuster him. So they allowed Chuck Hagel to be nominated. It's purely and absolutely rests on their shoulders. They gave up on the filibuster before we got the information. Ted Cruz was leading the effort, to try to get more information, and I was supportive of that. And when we voted again, when we came back, I was one of 27 to filibuster him. I have taken the opinion, though, and not everybody will agree on this, but I don't think it is a judgment that everybody can say they're absolutely right and someone else is absolutely wrong. I've taken the judgment that political appointees, the president does get some prerogative, because I think someday we will have a Republican president, and I want that Republican president to have some prerogative in choosing people who politically and ideologically do agree with him. I have many disagreements with Hagel, both from the conservative point of view as well as from the libertarian conservative point of view. He's been a supporter of foreign aid. He's been a supporter of UN involvement. He's been a supporter of the military draft, as well as many other things that libertarians object to. However, I also disagree with John Kerry, and I disagree with Jack Lew, and I don't think I agree with any of the political appointees that Obama's going to have. But in the end, I think he does get some leeway in deciding political appointees.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Let me see if I can translate this for the average person out there. I think what I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what I hear you saying is, on the Hagel issue, if we weren't going to filibuster, then that's just simply a waste of political capital. There's not a hill to die on there. But on this one, the issue wasn't determined yet. It wasn't decided yet, so there was an opportunity, in your view, to exert leverage, which no longer existed, in your view, on the Hagel nomination. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, the other thing about this nomination is I said repeatedly that this wasn't about the man, it wasn't about the nominee so much as it was about a constitutional principle. And many on our side, rightly or wrongly, were vilified by the media for saying, oh, you're making it personal about this man. And we were able to unite almost everybody out there, at least for a while, to say, you know what, this is an important constitutional principle. And you'll notice that most of the articles didn't write much about Brennan. It was all about the drone attacks and whether the president had the power to do this. And so I think in making it about a principle, we rose to a different level and were able to unite people. Even some people who have supported the president felt embarrassed that he was supporting this position that he never would have as a candidate and never would have as a senator.
Finally, what's been the aftermath of this? What has been the reaction that you've heard from people? And I think obviously you have raised the awareness of who you are and the issues you stand for. They're much more, people are much more aware of them than they were 10 days ago, which obviously I think is a good thing. But that also means when you raise a standard, people are going to say, well, now that's the baseline now. From now on, you have to meet that standard. And that doesn't mean you filibuster every day. That looks like grandstanding supreme.
I was going to say, Steve, that means the next time I go out, I have to speak for 14 hours. That's going to be a tough bar for me.
No, but they're going to see you as kind of the point man to take the hill when people run afoul of the Constitution. So you're going to kind of be expected now to be kind of that guy, so to speak.
I agree. I think the expectations will be higher, and we're trying to live up to that. I have to speak at CPAC on Thursday, and I was planning on just doing, my song and dance and tell a few jokes and leave. And my staff tells me, no, you have to give an important national speech now. They're going to expect it. And I say, well, darn, that's a lot of work I got to go through.
Can you just send them a best of tape from last week, maybe, and say, hey, go with that instead?
I got 13 hours worth of material now. Can't I just give them the edited version, the abbreviated version? So, but we will talk a little bit about that at CPAC. The Conservative Political Action Committee is a big speech for conservatives to attend, and I'll be speaking pretty early in the meeting starting Thursday afternoon, and so we're trying to prepare for that. In fact, I'm having to get off because I got to go back to that and have to get in the car for another meeting too. But let's do it again sometime, Steve.
You've got it. Senator Rand Paul, the only U.S. Senator with his own demo tape. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
You're listening to Steve Deace.
I like you.
You can agree with him, or you can be wrong. It's a free country. Steve Deace.
Well, let's get some reaction to what we just heard from U.S. Senator Rand Paul from the Amen Corner, who was listening attentively. Rebecca, I'm going to start with you because I asked one of your questions, which is reconcile the bold stand here on Mr. Brennan and then voting for Chuck Hagel. You heard his explanation, which was, hey, I was ready to filibuster that. The Republicans gave up on it, so, what's the point? They're going to pass it anyway. It's a waste of political capital, so let's save it for a hill that we actually think we can take, and we'll use it for this particular charge instead. You okay with that explanation?
I think it makes some sense as far as it goes. I appreciate him responding to that. I'm glad to know what his thinking was going into it. I guess the one follow-up that I would have is, maybe I don't know how these votes work, but isn't it possible to abstain rather than to vote for somebody? To confirm somebody? Sure,
you can vote present. You can just abstain, not be there for the vote. You can vote no. Yeah.
If that was an option, maybe that's something I would have looked at if I thought that this guy wasn't good for the job. I wouldn't say, yes, okay, go ahead. I'll just let the president's men, get into the president's pick, get into that job if I don't think he's the right person for the job because I think a vote is valuable. But I don't think that it's, this is not a deal breaker for me in considering Rand to be a good leader to follow. I wanted to know where the consistency is, what to expect from him as far as consistency, because I love everything that he had to say about the filibuster, and I wanted to know his motivation, basically.
Jen.
I think that Rand admitted something that deep down inside we've always known, that you, Steve Deace, inspire even senators to stand up and spout off as long as they possibly can.
That was empowering.
I don't think politicians need my inspiration to spout off.
Well, you were an encouragement to Rand Paul to continue to stand on that soapbox, and I'm glad that somebody finally voiced that. I think you really needed your just desserts.
I've been affirmed.
There you go. So now we can go home because Steve's been affirmed.
That's it. We're done here. Thanks for tuning in tonight, guys.
Yeah, it's all over but the singing. He's older than I am, although he looks younger than I am. I'm 41 years old. I've had children. The idea that I would wake up one morning without any prep whatsoever, go down to the floor of the United States Senate and start talking and then go, I think I could do this for an indeterminate number of more hours, and because I believe in something that much, and just speak for 13 hours. Now I know you're listening and you're thinking, yeah, you could, Jen. Really, 13 hours, no potty breaks, no sitting down, no stopping, just 13 hours. the fact that now we know that he didn't prep for this, like once upon a time we were talking about this that night, Strom Thurmond prepped for this. He knew what he was going to do, and he took a steam bath to dehydrate himself. He was prepped and ready to go, and then he did the 24-hour filibuster. Rand did more than half of that unprepped, unprepared, just based on how he believed that this president and this administration is shredding the Constitution and the rights of American citizens.
One of the things I loved about this is it takes a depth of worldview to do this. That's why I keep bringing up there were no gimmicks. You have to be a serious thinker. You have to seriously contemplate your positions and what their ultimate conclusion are. And you've heard me say this for many years, gals, doing the show next to me. The list of politicians whose intellect I actually respect, whether I agree with them or not, but the list of politicians whose intellect I actually respect it's a pretty short list. I don't think too many of them could have done this.
I know not many of them. And I wonder how many of, even something else that he said, that his staff had a notebook prepared on information about drone strikes and things like that. I wonder how many senators and representatives have something that they believe in so strongly that they have notebooks compiled of the of all the data and the information about these subjects.
Well, it goes toward that depth of worldview that I think Steve was just talking about. It's one of the things that I am impressed by, this whole filibuster, this whole phenomenon, is that depth, because I don't really care about drones. I mean, they're not my number one issue. Yes, I am growing to understand what they can represent. I do care very much about everything that Rand Paul and his team laid out in that filibuster. I do care about constitutional limits. I do care about preserving our rights. And I do care about the government that is just feels like they can willy-nilly trample all over those whenever the mood may strike them. I care about that. And it was because it was put in that type of context, because it's not just about a drone. It's not just about that one aspect. It's about this entire picture of government tyranny and returning to constitutional governance. That type of depth is what it took to inspire Americans like me, who probably don't care as deeply about drones as someone like Rand Paul, to actually get on this bandwagon and support him because of the greater cause.
And if he doesn't have that kind of depth of worldview, then other people that may not necessarily agree with the full conclusion of his premise, but see the general point you're talking about, don't come alongside and say, hey, I would like to get a piece of this action. I like when he said, well, in the Senate, the majority knows better than to defer to the minority. I so wanted to interrupt him right then and say, hey, could you do me a favor and tell John Boehner, Eric Cantor, that's how the House is supposed to run too? But I just didn't have the time. So maybe next time. More in a moment.
You're listening to Steve Deace.